the last estimate for 19, and we estimated our 20 estimates. And just want people to remember that when we were doing that, we were in the middle of a pandemic. Everything was closed down. You know, businesses weren't open. People were not working. So when we made those estimates over the 2 years, we cut the revenue estimates, taxes only, by $1.4 billion.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So our estimate dropped. Actuals, we were above the estimates by almost $164 million. That made a big dent in what we had projected as a reduction for 2020. We did also have a transfer because the Budget Stabilization Fund identified as far as a transfer into it, half of the money that came in above our revenue estimates, so our actual receipts above our revenue estimates, half of that went into the Budget Stabilization Fund. So we transferred about $82 million into the Budget Stabilization Fund. That's there, and it can be spent with an appropriation bill or by the State Finance Council. So when we left, we had about $48 million above estimates in income tax, $24 million in sales, or in corporation. Sales was about 52.5, and then compensating use was about 19 million. So 163 million, we were above our estimates. Then in October, right before our November estimates, we were above our estimates by in total taxes, $171 million. Right before our estimates, individual income was up about 47 million, corporate up about 38, retail sales about 32, and compensating use was up about $47 million. So when we look at those totals, it was pretty obvious that we were going to be raising our estimates. We ended the year above our actual receipts. We're above the estimates. In October, we were another $171 million above. So when we were sitting down at the table to work on our consensus estimates, we figured that we would be adding, we weren't quite sure how much. And going back to my conversation earlier, I think in financial terms, the key word is uncertainty. You know, we're really not certain on foreign policy. We're not going to be really certain on what our trade policy is going to be, health policy, what's going to change in tax policies, what are those economic conditions going to be in the pandemic. I mean, there's just so much uncertainty. Plus, in calendar year 2020, we saw the worst quarter ever, a decrease of 31% in economic growth, and followed by the best quarter ever, an increase of 33%. So wild fluctuations. These are estimates that when projecting out, they're normally talking about big changes being 0.5%. And we're talking about -31 and +33. So we sat down to do our consensus estimates. And when we're at the table, we ended up increasing our estimates for the current year by $477.2 million. So current year went up $477 $5.2 million above our April estimate. And that increase reflected an increase of $807 million above the previous year's actual receipts. One thing that do want to remind people, and that was part of the CARES Act, there was a move from the collection deadlines for income tax and corporate income tax from April to June. That moved all of those receipts that were not paid in April into June, and that's it's July, to the next fiscal year. So it moved from one fiscal year to the other. So we would have had a drop in income tax or in receipts in 2020, an increase in 2021, moving from April to July, and then a decrease in 2022 back to that normal lever. So we went abnormally low, abnormally high, and then 2022 is going to go back in that middle where we're expecting those receipts to revolve back down or resolve down to those normal levels. So in working through that as well, FY 2022, our first estimate was $7.5 billion, okay? We ended up dropping about $224 million in receipts. And that sounds really bad, but once again, it's because we were abnormally high in 21 because we had our normal April receipts from 21 and that was delayed from the previous fiscal year. So big change. It should start leveling out now. Some of the considerations we took when we were looking at the consensus revenues, we were looking at jobs, and the information I'm going to give you is tying back to that point in time so everybody understands what we were looking at. The job losses were pretty outstanding when compared to normal losses in years. The nation lost 22 million jobs in April and May. And at that point in time, they had gained about a little over 50% of those back. Kansas lost 144,000 jobs in that same time frame. And we've gained it had gained about 49% of those jobs back. Average weekly hours had declined from 35 hours in 2019 of September to 33.9 hours in September of 2020. Number of hours dropped. Hourly wages also dropped from $26.09 in 19 to $25.89 in 2020. So fewer hours, less wages. Once again, we were looking at some big changes that we were not really anticipating. The Kansas GDP for 2020 originally, and when we were looking back in April, we had that dropping 3.4%. The current estimate had it actually increasing to 1.7%. So it went from a negative to a positive. That was mainly around the stimulus money that was coming in, made a big impact into the estimate for GDP. 21 for Kansas, we had it in April at 3.4. We dropped it to 3.1% because once again, stimulus money coming in, we thought it was going to drop some. So we went from 3.4 to 3.1. Unemployment for the calendar year 2020, we had at 6.3, 21 at 4.3, and 22 at 3.8%. So We do have the unemployment dropping. The agriculture sector, I mean, it was hit as well, not just non-farm jobs, but also the ag. Remember back in time, the beef and pork plants, processing plants dropped. You know, they lost 60% of their capacity. Once again, it's brought back up from those April and May lows. Net farm income has kind of seen a steady tick upwards. Basically, that's been coming since like 2016. When we look at 2020, we think that's going to continue. The issue with farm income is that the share of government payments as a percentage of that net income is continuing to increase. We had in 2020 one round of the market facilitation payments, about $250 million, $1 billion overall. We had 2 rounds of the coronavirus food assistance payments, about $460 million and just under $400 million. Those are what's really keeping those farm incomes at a higher level. When we look at the oil and gas sector, once again, close to this time when we were doing these estimates, we had some actually negative dollar amounts per barrel. So, I mean, it was dramatic. We ended up estimating the average price at $30 for a barrel for 2021, up from in April when we had it at 25, about 26 million barrels. And then for 22, we had it increasing to about $35 a barrel, but the production dropping to about 23 million barrels. So kind of wrapping up that information, the word uncertain is where we're still at. We did add 477 million and drop because of that timing issue down to a reduction of about $224 million. So when we look at our actual receipts and our estimates for 2021 or 2020, we ended up higher than what we had anticipated. 2022, we raised $477 million. A large increase in income tax, about $270 million. Corporate, we added about $40 million. Retail sales at $80 million, and compensating use increasing by $90 million. So we had large increases. To a degree, I think the surprise to us was how strong sales and compensating use was. It is actually still above month over month receipts from the previous year that had been pretty flat, so it was a bit surprising. When we looked at 22, we had a reduction of about 210 million. When we were looking at the receipts for income tax, we can't identify exactly how much was pushed over, but we were thinking that that was somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 450 million. So when we see a $210 million drop, that's comparatively, excluding those receipts, still an increase for individuals. Same thing in corporate. We had a reduction of about 50 million, and the transfer amount we think is around 75 or so. So, I mean, that's kind of our receipts for our estimates. The other document I do have is then our December estimates to kind of give you an idea of where we are. We raised the 477 million. Right now, individual income tax is above that estimate by about $8 million. The change that really still surprising us is corporate is up almost $40 million above our estimates. Sales and compensating use is up about a little over $18 million. So our receipts year to date are up about $70 million for total taxes. So had been very pessimistic, sorry. Now less so. Do we think things are good? Not yet. We still have lots of concerns, lots of problems, but there's I think the concern we have more than anything is still around that uncertainty. How much are we getting in and how much impact is the $1 billion that came into Kansas plus from the CARES Act? I mean, how much of an impact is that having on revenue? We're still not sure. If it's having too large, we could have a problem in 22. We could look at the 21 receipts, what's going to happen in April. There's just a lot of uncertainty. But putting that kind of back into perspective, when we look at our profile, which I always want to say this, is not a prediction on what we think is going to happen. It's a planning document. It takes the trends that we have and just moves those forward. So not a prediction. We know things are going to change. We know income's going to change. We know sales, compensating use, those are all estimates. We know those are going to change. Expenditures, we're going to be changing expenditures. But putting it into perspective in a planning document for your use, we are expecting an ending balance without any additional adjustments of about $400 million in 2021. When we take the expenditures for 2021, $7.8 billion, use that as our starting point for expenditures for 2022. We have no other base to work with. Make some adjustments for school finance and human services caseloads. We're expecting to have a negative ending balance of about $120 million. Can't have that, so we'll know we'll be making changes in there, but that's just straight out projections without any adjustments coming into play. So that's kind of a summary of where we started, how we got to where we are, and then a projection on moving forward. I know the governor indicated last night that she was going to have a budget that had a $600 million balance. Do want to mention that this is all based on previous information. We'll get a new one out after we get the information from the governor on what all of the adjustments that the governor's making. So this will be good for today. You can throw it away this afternoon. So, but do want to let people know this is kind of our starting point for where we are, and then the governor will be making adjustments from these totals. That's what we'll be reflecting in this profile, the adjustments from these totals. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would be glad to answer any easy questions anybody has.
Easy questions? To all the members for Appropriations and Ways and Means, you should have received through email the document that JG was referencing to during his presentation. So you should have received that through email. I would like to follow up basically on the latter point that you were discussing in regards to the ending balance. As you mentioned, the governor in our State of the State speech last night said that in the current fiscal year would be ending with a $600 million balance. Obviously, that's going to be adjustments that will be made to the budget that will be need to be discussed and approved by the legislature. But in the document that you have before us right now, you're showing that in fiscal year 2021, as you mentioned, a little short of $400 million. Does that account for the proposed allotments that the governor had proposed back in July? And does it also include those allotments that would need legislative action?
The answer would be yes and no.
Okay.
The amount that is shown in here is there's a reduction of $374.5 million. That's the allotment that the governor had the authority to do. She's already went in and reduced those budgets by almost $375 million. That's done and reflected in here. What's not reflected in here is the governor's allotment plan that took legislative approval. So their total revenue and expenditure adjustment that the governor made, I believe, was about $705 million. So there's still money out there in the governor's plan. She had PMIB delayed payments that was in there, her allotment plan. There was a allotment that she was proposing for the Juvenile Justice Evidence-Based Programs Fund of about $42 million. And I believe that in her plan, she had a reduction of about $19 million in the LCC's coronavirus state general fund accounts. So those are not included in here.
So the figure that was given last night for the $600 million ending balance includes the allotments that she had the authority to make and also those that would take legislative action?
Director Profit would know that. I was just saying that those are the things that were not included in the profile. He'll let us know, I'm hoping today, on what was included.
Okay. Any committee members, do you have any questions? I'm showing that Representative Landwehr, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr.
Please unmute yourself.
And I've got an issue. I did. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
All right. I have a problem with a committee assistant that cannot access my email, so I have none of this paperwork in front of me whatsoever. So if someone sitting in that room can figure out how to get it up here, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if there's conversation going on, we can't hear. Not able to hear anything right now.
No, I can't hear anything either.
Representative Hoffman indicated that they're aware of it and that they're working on it.
Thank you.
That's good.
Okay, we should be back up and running. Can everybody hear that is joining us virtually? Okay, I'm seeing some head nods, so I apologize for that. Something happened within the room where we got disconnected. I think all of us understand that in this new era that we're in, we need to be fluid, and there might be some issues. So we're still kind of learning the aspects of the technology, so I apologize for that. Representative Landwehr, did you want to ask your question? And Representative Landwehr appears not to be on virtually. We'll go to the room then. Representative Helgerson.
JG, two parts to the question. First, isn't it statutory that the governor has to put a budget together according to existing law? And second, you know, this whole thing seems like I'm on a sugar high and that we got $1 billion worth of federal money, and that's keeping us all artificially high, but our employment's down, farm prices are down, oil and gas is struggling still. Aircraft industry is in the pot, you know, in the tubes. If they back off the funds, or when they back off the funds, how much of a gap is there and what's going to happen?
Let's start with the easy one first. The governor does have to submit a budget based on current law and with a 7.5% ending balance for 2022. So historically, going back many years, I believe it was going back to the Graves administration, the 7.5 ending balance portion of the budget was about 5 pages or 6 pages at the back that identified what the budget would be. The rest of the budget is normally around what the actual proposal is. So that's normally the way that they've been doing those in recent history. As for the second question, part of this is built in. I mean, when we were looking at some of the adjustments that were made in GDP, we had that higher and then dropping because we were believing that some of that stimulus money would be reducing some of that GDP. Same thing with some of the other areas. The impact of that is we're really not sure. It goes back to that uncertainty. We have some of that built in. Whether that's enough, we really don't know. We're still working on information that isn't complete on how much was transferred from one year to the other. We've made some adjustments in some of our indexes that we use. But the true impact of that will just have to be wait and see. So a lot of money coming into the state does stimulate the economy. We've adjusted for it. Is it enough? We're not sure. I hate to say that, but we're not sure.
Representative Helgerson, did you have a follow-up? Chairman Billinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. JG, when you mentioned the allotments were $375 million, and them were already done, so that's water under the bridge. But on them allotments, we did make the PMIB payment, correct? That was made, the 130 million or whatever it was?
Correct. For 2020, we made that payment. So that payment was made in 2020.
Okay, so we got half of it paid back, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Landwehr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Oh, I didn't have a question.
Oh, we had you down that you had a question, so.
That was earlier.
I apologize.
That was earlier. That's all right.
All right. Committee members, either in the room or virtually, do you have any further questions for JG in regards to the revenues? Representative Sutton.
You knew I couldn't get out of this meeting without asking something. JG, thank you, Mr. Chairman, first off. JG, looking at the profile for 2022, and this is probably just something that I need explained to me a little bit. With regard to this school finance consensus, this year I see a 27.9 million reduction. I assume that's probably CARES Act money that filled in some gaps. But looking at 2022, I see $207.5 million increase. Is that above and beyond what's legislated?
Very good question, Chairman. The amount of $205 million includes what was already legislated. So this is just a change from year to year. So the vast majority of that is that base rate increase that went up. So that's what almost all of that is. The reduction that we had was around some of the school bond and interest money, and then some of the weightings dropped as well with not quite as many people signing up for free and reduced lunches because they were getting most of those anyway. So those are some of the changes that were made. We can talk more detail about that as well. But those are the two big changes. While we're talking real quick about the profile, there was a reduction in caseload of $166.5 million. And that was all around the 6.2% federal money that was added in Medicaid. The FMAP rate went up 6.2%, and we have it for 3 quarters. If we looked at the caseload without that adjustment, it would show an increase. But because of the federal rate going up 6.2%, the state rate went down 6.2%, and that's what most all of that reflects, the $167 million reduction in state general fund.
Representative Sutton, did you have
Excellent.
a
Thank you
follow-up?
very much. Well, actually, I did have a follow-up, but as usual, JG anticipated my follow-up and that before I could ask it. So that settles it for me. Thank you very much.
Any further questions? Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. JG, will that FMAP rate continue on through in the 2022 budget?
That rate is dependent on the declaration of the federal disaster. So we know it's going to go through 3 quarters of this year. We're not sure when it's actually going to end. So if it continues on, it would reduce the state general fund need in Medicaid going forward. We're not sure when that's going to end, but until it does, we're just doing what we know as far as the information that we were giving on when that was going to be extended to.
Mr. Chairman, clarification. So that's a federal declaration of disaster, not us as a state.
Correct.
Extending our disaster. I assume the state has to have a declaration of disaster too to qualify for the federal.
I think we need somebody smarter than me answering that.
There's nobody smarter than you.
No better than that.
So, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions for JG? All right, I think those were easy enough. Thank you, JG, for being here and giving us that presentation. We'll go ahead and move on to the briefing of the governor's budget report. And so I would ask the newly appointed Director of Budget, Adam Proffitt, to address the committee.
Mr. Chair, can you hear me okay right now?
Yes, we can hear you now, Director Proffitt. Go ahead.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Chair Bellinger, for coming together as a joint committee so that I only had to go through this one time. I appreciate your flexibility on that. My name is Adam Prophet. As the chair pointed out, I'm the newly appointed director of the budget. Today actually marks day 30 for me in the office. So excited to be here and working with the staff, working with the governor to pull this budget together. Today I will be walking through the governor's recommended budget report. There are some cleanup items for fiscal 21, and then we will also get into fiscal 22, and that's actually where we will spend the majority of our time. I'm not sure if you can see a picture of my face on the screen right now or not. It should probably just be the governor's budget report, which is a better thing for everybody watching online. But the committee should have emailed around the budget report. Everybody that is on the committee should have in your inbox so that you can follow along. And there is a bit of background noise coming through from 112. So have that muted. So again, the email has been sent around to the committee. Everybody should have this in their inbox. For those listening online that choose to follow along, I'm not sure that you will be able to see this online. So as an alternative, I believe the staff at KLRD has posted this, or the legislative staff has posted this online. So you can hop online and pull it down if you so choose to follow along. I will do my level best to make sure I am pointing to the exact page that we are on in case you're trying to follow along on your own computer screen. So with that, Mr. Chair, I think I will just go ahead and jump right in. So on page 2, gives an overview of the agenda of the items that we're going to talk about. As mentioned, this will be fiscal 21 adjustments, as well as fiscal 22 recommendations. The governor is proposing a one-year budget again for these agencies, except for those that are on the biennial, the fee funds that are on a biennial. So this is just a one-year budget. So we'll start with the context, the framework, or a backdrop, if you will, behind which the budget decisions were made. I'm going to breeze past the November CREs, as JG just did a phenomenal job explaining that process. But then we're going to get into how we made the decisions on the budget and what some of the highlights are. Continuing the focus on budget stabilization, we'll talk about education, both K-12 and higher ed. We're going to talk about the investments the governor would like to make in IT modernization and economic development. We will touch on human services and spend some time on human services and mental health services, which would include Medicaid expansion. Then we'll move into protecting the core services that the governor thinks are key to protecting this budget to ensure that the citizens of Kansas are receiving the services that they need. At the very end, we'll talk about the spending and profile tables, which will give a clearer picture of a line by line of all the numbers associated with everything that we're going to talk about. And then time permitting, I will certainly be willing to stand around for questions. So with that, if we move on to page 3, this is the backdrop, if you will, behind which we were making the budget decisions and that the governor wanted to make sure that we highlighted. As mentioned, the pandemic persists not only in Kansas, but across America and across the world. This is a global health pandemic. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar, just last week on January 7th, did extend the official declaration of a public health emergency that was set to expire on January 21st. It has now been extended for 30 days. As the new administration comes in, obviously as time draws near to April 20, they will take a look at where things are at. They would have the authority to then extend further. For the hope of the health, we certainly, the nation, we hope that doesn't have to get there. Well, the federal government is continuing to focus their relief dollars on stabilizing the economy across the nation. And you can see with, certainly the most recent round and some of the other investments they've made with relief dollars, that they are also interested in protecting core services and ensuring that citizens of America are able to receive the services that they need. So this governor's budget, the decisions were really focused on reacting to the needs that have been highlighted by the pandemic. There have certainly been many, but also avoiding any major profile altering changes to the budget. As JG mentioned, the two words he is using are fluid and uncertain. We certainly feel the same way that the economic outlook, while improving, is still uncertain. We do not know what the coming year is going to bring. To illustrate that point, I put the unemployment rates for Kansas and the U.S. on the bottom left of this table. You can see the U.S. unemployment rate in orange and the Kansas unemployment rate in blue on this table. Both the U.S. and Kansas were enjoying historically low unemployment rates heading into this pandemic, doing very, very well. Kansas a little bit lower than that of the U.S. When March and April hit, things obviously changed for everybody. And there was a large spike in unemployment both in the Kansas and the U.S. Since that time, we've seen improvement. You can see that the slope coming down for both the U.S. and Kansas is relatively similar, and that the gap between Kansas and the U.S. Remains pretty consistent as well, meaning the U.S. Unemployment rate is higher than that in Kansas. I point this out to show that, we are certainly dealing with an economic crisis here in Kansas, but it is not specific just to Kansas. It's really across the nation. And again, there are signs of improvement in the economy across a couple of different sectors, but the economic outlook does remain uncertain across the nation. On page 4 of this presentation is just a one-pager of the CRE. It compares fiscal 20 actuals versus the fiscal 21 estimate, which was updated in November, and the fiscal 22 estimate. It's up to the chair. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. JG, again, did a very good job of explaining what's happening here. We can circle back to it at the end, should you so choose. But for now, I'd like to just move right into page 5, please. Pardon me while I take a drink of water. So I think it's important to understand the governor's mindset heading into building this budget. This budget is really built on 2 key principles. One is responding to the needs highlighted by the pandemic while protecting core services and keeping Kansans on the path of fiscal responsibility and economic growth. What you're going to see here as we move through the presentation are investments in some really, really critical functions for the state. IT modernization, transportation, public safety, certainly mental health services, education. And then again, as mentioned, economic development tools to ensure that we are continuing to strengthen the economy as we move forward. The second is one that you've heard the governor talk about many times over the past several years. This is the analogy of tools back in the budget toolbox. So with this budget cycle, we're going to continue to focus on putting tools back in the budget toolbox. By remaining steadfast in our commitment with the legislature and with the governor to restore stability to the state's finances, over these past couple of years, we've made some really, really strong improvements here. We've been able to weather the storm as best as possible to date, and having strong ending balances and putting these tools back in the toolbox will certainly help us to weather any more storms that might come as we head into 21 and beyond. So with that, we'll jump into some of the actual budget decisions. And I'm going to work backwards from those 2 principles, starting with putting tools back into the toolbox. So on page 6 here of the presentation, again, you should have this in your email, or it should be on the screen as a screen share right now. But on page 6, wanted to make sure that we are maintaining a laser focus on preserving a healthy ending balance for both fiscal 21 and fiscal 22. It's important because the ending balance is really the first line of defense against any economic downturn. Because we had healthy ending balances coming into the pandemic, we were able to, again, weather some of that storm came our way, continuing to protect those ending balances just position us as we move forward, again, into 21 and 22. We're able to meet the obligation for an ending balance in fiscal 22 while reducing the reliance on KDOT transfers. So you can see there in the table at the bottom, fiscal 21 ending balance of 10.1%. Fiscal 22, as we work through everything in this presentation, we're still going to maintain the ending balance at 7.5%. Now, I do want to talk PMIB loan. There was a question to JG on that from, I believe it was Chairman Billinger. The initial allotment plan this summer called for reborrowing against the $132 million that was paid off previously against the PMIB loan. 2 things with PMIB. The plan that we presented last year showed that we would pay the remaining balance this year in fiscal 21 to get that off of our books and move on from it. Because of where we're at, we decided that with a 0% interest against that PMIB, it would be more prudent to push paying that back out into the out years. So you will see that there's no payback of the open PMIB balance in fiscal 21 or 22. We will start that process in fiscal 23, and we're going to put it on a 10-year payback plan. Now, just because we put it on a 10-year payback plan does not mean it will take 10 years. If the economy continues to improve and we continue to have strong ending balances, we'd be able to pull some of those payback schedules up a little bit. But key here again is the allotment this summer called for reborrowing against the $132 million. Because of where we landed and because of revenues coming up, we no longer need to do that. So we will not be reborrowing against $132 million available in the PMIB. Moving on to page 7, again, continuing the commitment of budget stability and then riding the ship, if you will. The government has been pretty consistent in her message that she wants to close the bank of KDOT, as it were, by the end of her first term. Table below shows the transfers out of the highway fund and into the general fund dating back to fiscal 10. We add all those numbers up, including what we're doing now, and in fiscal 22, transferred over $2.3 billion, billion with a B, out of the highway fund and into the state general fund. So this it calls for in fiscal 21, we're going to maintain the $133 million transfer out of the highway fund into the general fund, which was already discussed. But in fiscal 22, we're going to cut that transfer out of the highway fund in half. We're going to get down to $66.9 million, which is, you can see on this chart, is the lowest level since fiscal 15. Beyond that, assuming finances hold and we can continue down this path of fiscal responsibility, that transfer is completely eliminated in fiscal 23. So again, if you look back at some of those big numbers that we've done in just last year, $231 million, we're going to be at zero out of the highway fund and into the SGF by fiscal 23. For those following along on online, we're going to move on to page 8. Pardon me. We are going to talk about amortizing capers and the legacy unfunded actuarial liability. The title on here says that we are going to re-amortize this over 25 years, and that is technically correct. As a reminder, the current amortization schedule to pay back this legacy unfunded actuarial liability goes for an additional 15 years from now. So really, this represents a 10-year extension to the current amortization schedule, making a total of 25 years. There are sure to be debates about the merits of this, both good and bad, in the coming days and months as we discuss this. Here are some of the benefits. It immediately frees up $158.7 million of SGF in fiscal 22, which provides some much needed budget flexibility, stability, and relief. Now, the KS board, while probably not to support that this year, I think that's fair to say that they would not be in favor of supporting that this year. They're sure to consider re-amortizing this legacy unfunded liability in the coming years. I'll be clear comment there. I'm not speaking for the Capers board, and I am not saying they are going to do this. What I am saying is many states, when they get to within 10 years or the 80% funded ratio, consider extending the amortization schedule of their pension plans. Capers board has come out in recent years and said they are going to consider this and do a study on this. The point is we have an option to either pull that trigger now or wait for the Capers board to do their study in a few years and then. Choosing to do it now provides immediate stability. We've talked about the perilous economic condition that we're in and making sure that we need to steady the ship and make sure things are on a good path. This allows us to have a tool to do that now. It allows us to focus the AGF dollars on preserving the resources and necessary programs for our citizens while continuing to navigate this global pandemic. Again, public health emergency declaration was extended for another 3 months and very well could be extended in the future. So this allows us the freedom to spend money on critical areas that need to be state. Excuse me. There are two at the bottom of this page on page 8 that show some of the benefits here. So on the left, this shows the current amortization schedule and how much the state is committing towards this amortization versus the re-amortization plan and what the difference would be. So you can see the current baseline column for fiscal 22, the state is committed to paying $658 million towards this unfunded liability. Under the re-amortization plan, our commitment would drop to $499 million. That's where we realize $158 million of SGF savings in fiscal 22. In fiscal 23, beyond, you can see that the current baseline grows upwards of nearly $700 million of state commitment. Re-amortizing plan grows to only $521 million, 522 if you round up. A difference of $173 million of freedom for the SGF to be spent on protecting critical needs for Kansans. On the right is different. What this shows is the state and school contribution rates that we had to put towards this to ensure that we are adequately funding the amortization schedule. So that current baseline of 15%, that's what we have in the amortization schedule today, is that we need to commit 15% of the salary for the state and school towards the current amortization schedule. That number drops to 14.5% by fiscal 25. Under the amortization plan, you'll see that that drops by over 3 percentage points. So our commitment for the contribution rates drops to 11.92%, drops by 6 cents all the way out to fiscal 25 to 11.32%. And I'll talk about why that's important on the next slide. So as we move into slide 9, let's talk about what KPERS reamortization does and does not do, because this question comes up every year. So I just want to make sure we are crystal clear with what we are trying to accomplish and what the impacts will and will not be. So by reamortizing KPERS, it will not reduce, diminish, jeopardize, threaten, or weaken member benefits. And that is for both current and future retirees. Reamortizing KPERS will not harm their benefits. What reamortizing KPERS will do is maintain member benefits for current and future retirees. Reamortizing KPERS also, again, provides much needed budget flexibility and relief to the tune of $158.7 million in fiscal 22 and $160.8 million in fiscal 23. That's going to provide budget stability in the coming years. The employer contribution rates, the difference of 15% versus 11.92%. This makes for a more manageable level of employer contribution rates. It's important because as recently as I believe it was fiscal 17 and 19, excuse me, somebody please fact check me on that. We did miss some KPERS payments. So by having a manageable employer contribution rate as we go forward allows the state a greater chance at fully funding that every year at the commitment that is required under the pre-amortization schedule. By not re-amortizing, those contribution rates remain rather high, and it can be tempting if we run short of cash to kind of reduce that and miss a payment and catch it up the next year. Also, I know there have been a lot of questions about where the funded ratio is. It was quite abysmal in the not too distant past, down in the 50-52% rate. We are now at 70% funded on the legacy unfunded actuarial liability. By re-amortizing, that remains at 70% today, and it continues to grow as we move forward into the future, marching towards 100%. We'll move on from KPERS to the next agenda topic on page number 10. We're going to make sure we are protecting local businesses, and we're going to do that by leveling the playing field for local businesses with fair tax policy. So there are two policies that are on the docket for your review here today. One is the compensated use tax on digital property. The other is the marketplace facilitators and to have them start collecting tax for out-of-state businesses selling in Kansas. So let's start with the first one. I'm sure most of the folks in this room know what this is for, but just as a reminder, if I walk into a record shop, I just did that this past weekend and look at records or CDs or any other kind of music. When I'm at this Kansas storefront, this brick and mortar in Kansas, I'm going to purchase that and I'm going to pay sales tax on top of that. So say a CD costs $10, I'm also going to throw a buck on top of that for sales tax. However, if I'm online and I buy the same album only in a digital format, I'm not paying sales tax on that. That immediately puts that local business who has chosen to invest in Kansas and real estate here and employees here at a disadvantage against their competitors that are online. But it's level on the field for Kansas businesses. It's also going to, by closing that loophole, it's going to increase the SGF revenues by $42.7 million in fiscal 22 and beyond. Excuse me. On marketplace facilitators, it's a similar concept, but a little bit different. And that is for, again, storefronts in Kansas that have chosen to be in Kansas and part of this community. They offer product. You walk in, you buy a T-shirt online, or excuse me, in the store for $20. There's going to be, a couple bucks additional on top of that for sales tax. It's part of the game. However, for those who are out of state and buy product online in Kansas through a marketplace facilitator, they are not required to pay that additional or try to collect that additional $2 in sales tax. So again, our local businesses are put at a great disadvantage by having the inequity in the tax code between the marketplace facilitator and the physical storefronts here. By closing that loophole, it's going to increase revenues by $43.1 million in fiscal 22. One thing key to note on the next bullet point, while not every state collects sales tax, for every state that does collect sales tax, this is one of only 3 states that has not yet enacted a marketplace facilitator provision. So this is, again, to protect local businesses, but also to keep up with the shift in economics and America. And between the two, the 43.1 million for marketplace facilitator and 42.7 for digital property, you're looking at an increase of 85.8 million for fiscal 22. And those numbers, those are high-level estimates. As a fiscal note comes out on any bill that may be presented, we'll make sure to tidy those up and get those in front of the proper committees. Move on to page 11. Talked about the budget preservations and how we're going to stabilize the budget with the revenue side. 11, we're going to the other side of the ledger and talk about the investment we're making in Kansas and how we are going to protect core services for our citizens to make sure they're getting everything they need from us. We're going to start with education. Again, the governor's steadfast commitment, along with many of you, in fully funded education. So here, as Campbell was given this presentation, he made the mention that this would have been the first session in many, many years that you were starting with a fully constitutional K-12 budget. For year number 2 in a row, the governor is fully funding K-12 education, which is in line with the Supreme Court's decision from a couple of years ago. And it's a whole lot of time on the table down below, other than you can see what the base aid for student excellence is there for fiscals 20, 21, and 22. And then at the very bottom there, the total state foundation aid, you can see what the corresponding dollar amounts are there for that. One thing, the fiscal 21 column, you'll see a decrease in total dollar amount due to a decrease in the unweighted FTE enrollment at the top. So it's not a decrease in funding against the formula, rather a decrease in the unweighted FTE enrollment that you see at the top there. So just want to make sure we're clear on that. Slide 12, if you don't mind, please, talking about higher education. Before we get into this, I'll pause and set the table for where we are for the next several slides as we talk about various agency budgets and protecting these core services. So past summer, as we recognized that there was uncertainty in the economy and that the April CREs were coming in much, much lower than anybody could have thought a couple of months before, the governor for every state agency to submit a budget for fiscal 22 that was 10% below what it normally would have been. So, for example, if an agency were to normally carry their 21 budget into 22, that would be their starting point. The governor, oh, we need to make spending cuts here. Wise about them. So everybody start with a 10% across the board cut. Over the course of looking through the budget and working with my staff here in the office, she was able to identify some wiggle room in the budget with the increase in CREs and good news there, that we were able to go back in and invest and protect some of these budgets. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about on the next several slides will be restorations against that 10% cut. In some instances, you'll see that we were able to fully restore that 10% spending cut. But in most instances, we're going to see that we were not able to fully restore, but we got as much as we could to protect these core services. So we, again, start with higher education and continue that discussion on education and what it provides to the state in the out years. Develop a strong work base here. There is a $26 million allotment for Board of Regents in the 22 budget. And really what there was a funding swap in 21 that reduced their SGF kind of artificially in 21, and that got carried forward to their 22 base. So their starting point with their 22 budget was a 10% cut plus the $26 million. that we rectified that, and we're restoring that $26 million into their base. From it was made that the governor wanted to restore parts of the 10% cut for various functions within Board of Regents and the work that they do. So the plan is on the universities, the four-year universities. She restored $27.4 million from their reduced resource package. Now, what that equates to is giving back about 45% of the cut. So they are now, instead of taking a 10% cut, they are taking a 5.5% cut from what their base budget would have been for the 4 years. Moving on to the secondary institutions, which would be the community colleges and the technical schools and things of the like, the governor was able to restore $14.9 million to that budget. What that represents is an 80% restoration. So instead of taking a 10% cut for the 2 years in technical schools, we're only taking a 2% cut in that bucket there. For the student financial assistance, which is direct aid for students as they're getting financial assistance for education via the community schools of the 4 years, that budget is $24 million. So a 10% cut equated to $2.4 million. The governor thought it would be wise to reinstate that in its entirety, so she put the entire $2.4 million back in that budget. The next item for Board of Regents is adding $10.4 million to their administrative budget. Now, what this represents an amount equal to funding a 2.5% pay increase for university employees, because they kind of fall outside of the typical state employee pay structure, if you will. So 10.1 million equals a 2.5% pay increase. However, instead of prescribing the board to go out and do an across-the-board 2.5% increase for university employees, she thought it best to go ahead and give them the money in an administrative bucket and let the board decide what their top administrative needs are across the entirety of the system and allow them to spend that money sort of at their discretion with parameters, of course, for their administrative priorities. On to page 30, talk about laying the foundation for the economy and investing in economic development. The Department of Commerce is no different. The Department of Commerce has been on quite a hot stretch lately. If you look at what they were able to do last year, I think there were some news articles showing that they had some record-breaking capital investments in Kansas to the tune of $2.5 billion, billion with a B, in new capital investments in Kansas. That we were able to bring in companies like Amazon, Urban Outfitters, and some others sort of all across the state to invest in Kansas. So the governor wanted to restore the entirety of the 10% reduced resource package for the Department of Commerce, including $1.3 million in the economic development funds. This allows the Department of Commerce to continue focusing on all these key programs, which include more than just these groundbreaking massive investments, but also the Main Street program in rural America, international trade operations, going after community development grants and the Build Up Kansas programs. Investments in economic development show a very, very strong payout. I mean, the little bit of money that we're putting in there again is going to be paid back tenfold if we continue on this pace of record-breaking economic development. If we get on over to slide 14, again, for those of you that have this online or at home, slide 14. The governor is very much interested in investing in IT modernization. Some key budget priorities at the outset that, the pandemic has highlighted some needs, and a lack of investment in IT modernization is certainly one of those. And one I'm sure that comes in front of mind for everybody is the Department of Labor's 40-some-year-old systems. So that became a very top priority, and work has already begun on this, but the governor is leveraging between federal and special revenue funds $37.5 million to update the unemployment insurance IT systems. Goal is to make sure, obviously, we course correct and get on the right path right now, but also to build a system that is able to move into the future and handle any other economic surges or increases in unemployment down the road, God forbid. Corrections, we're going to invest some much needed funding there for their IT system, the juvenile and offender management information systems, to the tune of $3.1 million. Department of Human Services, $2 million for electronic health records for support and maintenance for the EHRs for the state hospitals, and also $1 million for comprehensive child welfare information system. The next line down there is I take a drink of water, excuse me. Next line down is for the the Office of Information Technology Services. For those of you that have had the pleasure with Secretary Burns Wallace about the state's IT infrastructure, she is very, very passionate about this, and rightfully so, that we are sitting on a woefully antiquated infrastructure, the state's IT system is. So it is absolutely critical to ensure that we're investing in upgrading the infrastructure so that we can continue to have the safe and secure government programs that we need online. So we're investing $4.3 million for rehab and repair into the Office of Information Technology. And then finally on this page is $6.6 million as a part of their IT modernization roadmap. They too expressed a need to upgrade their systems. I think what they're sitting on is a really, really old one that needs to be modernized as we move forward into the new age. So if we change over to slide 15, I gave a bit of a preview on slide 14 of what we're planning here, and the governor announced the other day that she is announcing an ERO to create the Department of Human Services. What we'll do is combine the current Department for Children and Families with the Department for Aging and Disability Services, DCF and KDAS. I'm not going to speak to any budget savings in this merger as part of this presentation. But what this does do is enhance the level of service that our citizens across the state lean on these agencies to get the services and the help that they need all across the state. And, you know, you've heard the term one-stop shop, or being able to stop into one office with what would currently be a DCF and a KDAS issue. So from young life all the way through aging, one agency is going to be able to take care of all of that. There are a lot of natural synergies. But on their budget, again, currently it's DCF and KDAS. For the purposes of this presentation, we combine them into just one DHS budget. So please keep that in mind as we move forward this slide and the next one. They, as part of their reduced resource package, the 10% cut that we asked for, took a $57.7 million hit. Governor is recommending restoring $40.5 million of that to ensure that we're protecting these critically needed programs for some of our state's most vulnerable. There are also some additional funds or enhancements that are being proposed for high-impact areas of need. $2 million I spoke about on a previous slide for EHR support and maintenance. $3.6 million for adoption assistance growth, making sure that we are adequately funding the adoption assistance program for those Kansas families that are choosing to adopt children in Kansas. $600,000 for community integration housing first program. We'll move on to page 16. This is still within the Department of Human Services, but we want to focus on some of the investments and the enhancements for behavioral health and mental health services in Kansas. The pandemic, early on in the pandemic, I was with KDHE as the Medicaid director and spent a lot of time with a lot of the advocates, and they were very clear that, you know, this pandemic, post being a home, you know, mental health services are a critical need. So the governor recognizes that and wants to make sure that we're investing in protecting those services as we move forward. To that end, she is remaining $2 million for CMHC specialized services in the NFMHs, or the nursing facilities for mental health. Another will be targeted for statewide mobile response and stabilization. And what this program does is provides community-based interventions and individualized care planning. So keeping that treatment center in the community and making sure it's individualized for each of the individuals needing the services. Excuse me, pardon me. $3 million for family crisis response and support. This is really targeted to youth under the age of 18 anywhere in Kansas communities. Or young adults, age 18, 20 to 21, who have aged out of the foster care system that are experiencing some acute behavioral and psychiatric emergencies. This is going to provide them with rapid community-based crisis intervention, again, community-based rapid crisis intervention services, regardless of their healthcare insurance status. So really making sure that we're taking care of the youth that are experiencing these emergencies and getting to them as quickly as we possibly can. I've got a bullet on there for Department of Corrections in Lansing. I'm going to speak to that on a subsequent slide. So we're going to go ahead and move past that if you don't mind. So again, just following along at home, we should be on page 17 now. The governor is again proposing to expand Medicaid to the full adult expansion population beginning 1/1 of 22. Expand Medicaid It's going to provide access to critical healthcare services for some of our state's most vulnerable low-income citizens. About 165,000 is the current estimate. Yes, in the past, we've known about 150,000 as the estimate. With a downturn in the economy and Medicaid expansion being tied to income numbers, felt it prudent to up that estimate to 105,000. It's going to be a $19 million investment out of the SGF in fiscal 22, but that will draw down $541 million of federal funding at the same time. And let me be clear about these numbers. This is a placeholder. The agency would be working on the fiscal note for any bill should it be presented. They will have the more final numbers. And we feel confident that, excuse me, based on what we know about a basic Medicaid expansion program, it would be in the neighborhood of 19 million SGF, which draws down 541 million of federal funding. If you put those numbers together, the state obligation for the cost of expansion is between 3 and 4 cents on the dollar. So again, every dollar that goes to healthcare services for our low-income residents, we're paying 3 to 4 cents on the dollar. So we could receive in a full year maybe over $1 billion of healthcare services for these individuals, and the state is paying through $30 to $40 million approximately. Since last year, 2 more states expanded their Medicaid programs to the full adult expansion population, leaving Kansas as one of only 12 states to not yet expand eligibility. The 2 states that did expand last year were Missouri and Oklahoma. That means that as of now, every single state that shares a border with Kansas has expanded Medicaid eligibility. There have been asked about the concerns possibly of folks migrating over from one state or another to receive these services for Kansas taxpayers. That's no longer a concern. Kansas is now an island of non-expansion in the Midwest here. Okay, we can slide on over to page 18. We talked about protecting some of the core services. So Highway Patrol. Highway Patrol, some may not know it, they are the only law enforcement agency in the state of Kansas with air support. And when they go up in the air support, they are not only providing highway patrol functions, but they are also helping other local communities to support them in the air with some of their needs. So the governor is proposing $16 million in fiscal 21 to upgrade their aging aircraft fleet. This will include is purchasing 2 new helicopters and 1 single engine plane. It also upgrades the technology to the existing fleet, some of the infrared systems that they need and some of the other technology that goes on. I couldn't even begin to tell you what they are, but I'm sure Colonel Jones would be happy to tell you about that. $3.3 million for the Highway Patrol over fiscals 21 and 22 for career progression plan aid to ensure that they are able to pay adequately so they can recruit and retain the highest quality public safety officers available to us. Department of Corrections. There was a corrections crisis a couple of years ago, and some of our inmates had to be moved out of state and more contract beds in Arizona. We were able to put inmates back into Kansas recently. Not having those contract beds out there, we are realizing a savings of $9.1 million in fiscal 21. Talked about the investment in their modernization of IT. Excuse me, but one I'd like to touch on a little bit more is the investment in Winfield and Lansing facilities. So we're looking at $13.3 million between fiscals 21 and 22 for the expansion of the Winfield and Lansing facilities. So specific in Winfield, it's to add a specialized care for inmates with acute health conditions, specifically geriatric population with chronic medical and or cognitive care issues. And what we mean by that is talking about, again, the elderly and disabled, kind of frail, aging population that may be dealing with issues like dementia, Alzheimer's, things of that nature. So having that there. Another tangential benefit, the Winfield facility and the Veterans Center there share a kitchen located on campus of the Veterans Home. So new kitchen and dining facilities will increase capacity for serving the population and separates the operations between the 2 agencies. We're talking about Lansing to provide an intensive substance use abuse treatment for inmates that are preparing for release. And that's going to allow for a better integration into society upon release. What that does is make, again, cleaner integration into society. So instead of sitting in prison waiting for the days to count down, they're going to be able to receive this really critical substance abuse treatment to get them ready for release to society, to become better members of society. It also drives down recidivism rates. Studies have showed that across the nation, you can see a reduction in recidivism rates of 7 to 8, maybe even 9% by having some of these programs in place. What it does is it actually frees up our budget down the road because we're going to have to spend less on corrections as we're cycling less and less folks back into the corrections system. So the twofold certainly is helping those get back in society, but also helps the state budget as we move forward. The next slide, continuing to talk about core services on slide 19, in General's office. I think the General, they're on day 307, I think, of their operations here. So we're going to begin the design work for remodeling the state defense building. That's going to be $1.6 million to start that project. Certainly it'll be a larger multi-year project, but this will at least start getting that going to upgrade the State Emergency Operations Center, as well as KDEM, the Division of Emergency Management. We're also going to allocate $1.5 million, that's all funds, so about $750,000 of SGF for deferred maintenance on R&R armories, the rehab and repair of the armories all across the state. The General has been pretty clear that it is time, probably beyond time, to ensure that we are rehabbing and repairing these armories to make sure that they're fully functional for our citizens across the state. And then transportation, we touched on this earlier about reducing the reliance, the SGF reliance on the KDOT funds and keeping those funds in highway. Not only is that good fiscal practice and it keeps the SGF in a healthy position, it also keeps the highway funds targeted towards moving forward with the Eisenhower Legacy Plan that was approved with overwhelming support from the legislature in 2020. We keep those dollars focused on the Eisenhower Legacy Plan. We're going to be able to move forward with some of these physical infrastructure programs and improving our roads and our sidewalks and the economy down the road. It's going to create thousands of jobs as we move forward with this really, really powerful plan here. Page 20. I call this investing in employees, core service as well. So as with Board of Regents, there was an amount equal to the 2.5% pay increase. On this slide, we'll talk about a direct pay increase for state employees. So the governor is proposing $15.3 million of SGF to fund a 2.5% pay increase for all state employees. Now, this does include members of the executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch. Sorry, committee does not include legislators or statewide elected officials, but it does include the staff of those legislators and statewide elected officials. Again, the Board of Regents was allocated separate funds equal to 2.5%, but they're going to do something else with that potentially, whatever they deem the top priority. This money is specifically earmarked for a 2.5% pay increase for state employees. You know, there was a long time there, a long stretch where we're unable to fund 2.5% or any kind of an increase for state employees. We've gotten back on track with the support of the legislature over the past couple of years. Unfortunately, last year, we were not able to fund the pay increase. So we're hoping that there will be support here to fund that 2.5% pay increase. Investing a small amount in pay increase for the state employees is just a really powerful tool to ensure that we're able to attract and retain talent and to show a token of administration. You know, they've been stretched really thin over the past few months and have had a mobile workforce, and we just want to make sure that we're taking care of our employees as they do good work for our citizens. So moving on to slide 21. This is where we can start to see some of the answers to some of the questions that have been asked as we start to line item out most of the big ticket items. So this is the State Fiscal 1 expenditure tab or profile for fiscal 21. So starting from the bottom, I will walk through. The beginning balance was $495 million. The CRE numbers of $7.7 million in adjustments for a total available of $8.3 million, $8.355 billion total available. The expenditure being proposed for 21 with the adjustment come in at just short of 7.6 billion, 7587.7. Down below, you can see some of the key adjustments that are included. So reappropriations of 351 million, allotment of 374.5 million, which was discussed earlier. Agency reduced requests, 135 million, again, asking for spending cuts there. $166 million of enhanced FMAP, as JG alluded to. In the public health emergency declaration, Medicaid agencies are given an increase of 6.2 percentage points for Medicaid funding. So that helped to the tune of $166.5 million. Passing reappropriations, K-12 caseloads down 27.8. Again, that is not a decrease in funding, but rather tied to a decrease in the FTEs and the weighting there. Round 3 public salaries, caseloads, some fee swaps. Again, that returned the out-of-state inmates that I discussed earlier, $9.1 million. Board of Indigent Defense Services, council caseload drops, so $3 million savings there. State fair, $1 million went there. And some of the others into an ending balance of $767 million for fiscal 21. The page on the page 22, that 77 ending from 21 becomes our 767 beginning for fiscal 22. November release of $7.4 billion. Governor's tax policy adjustments of $85.8 billion. Again, that goes back to the marketplace facilitator and the compensating use of digital product. Governor's transfer adjustments of $224 million. Total available $8.5 billion. The expenditures tied to this budget is $7.9 billion. Below the K-12 caseload, we talked about that. The higher education reduction package. So again, we asked for a 10% cut. We ended up between a 5.5% and 2% cut, depending on which of the buckets they were in. 10.4, this is higher ed discretionary funding. Again, that's tied back to what it would take to fund a 2.5% increase. Medicaid expansion, $19 million. I want to touch on this health and human service caseloads, the $204.8 million. So this is the opposite in 21. So in 21, we saw a good guy, a savings, because of the increase of FMAP of 6.2 percentage points. This is the majority of this increase here is due to that 6.2 percentage point temporary increase going away. Again, that is due to the timing of the emergency declared by the Health and Human Services Secretary. Right now, it only goes through Q2, calendar quarter Q2. So we cannot estimate that we're going to receive any of this in fiscal 22. Medicaid non-case loads, human services initiatives, state reductions, contract bed funding, again, the savings there, medical contract for corrections, and some other items, agency reduction packages, $25 million, state employee pay plan, and then again, there's the capers reamortization that we talked about with $158.7 million savings. It's our ending balance of $600.9 million. To slide 23, you'll see the SGF outlook and profile. Back to fiscal 17 and goes through fiscal 22 that we got rec. So again, should beginning balances, you'll see the same revenue side and transfers. You'll see the expenditures getting all the way through. Slide on down to the very bottom, you can see the ending balances. $767.7 million for fiscal 21, $600.9 million for fiscal 22. One thing I've not yet mentioned, and my apologies for not doing so earlier, should have brought this in earlier in the deck, that budget stabilization fund balance is sitting below the line there. We are pulling that into the fiscal 22 as a revenue. So it's sitting there. It came about in fiscal 20, stayed there in 21, but we're moving it into the revenue side on fiscal 22. So that'll be zero at the end of fiscal 22. So in summary, just want to review the budget priorities and some of the things that we talked about. So again, the economy is showing signs of improvement, but the outlook remains uncertain, not just in Kansas, but also across the nation. We're trying to get everything back on track, and we're trying to protect the core services that we can while we're doing so. The two key budget priorities are the tenets that this was built on, responding to the pandemic and building the toolbox and some of the issues and initiatives that we put into there. And then also noting that this budget comes with no increases in personal or corporate income taxes. So again, we're budget stability, we're investing in core services, we're investing in economic development, we're investing in education, and we're able to maintain that ending balance at 7.5%. So that would conclude my prepared remarks, Mr. Chairman, and I would be happy to stand for any questions. Before we get there, if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and stop sharing here. This 2021 is still in the world of COVID. I am in a conference room. Generally, I would have an army of folks that are much smarter than I sitting right behind me to help answer questions. I have very few folks in here with me. We will answer as many questions as we possibly can with the information that we have. It could be that I need to circle back to the committee. My commitment to you and to the rest of the committee is any question asked, if I don't have the answer, we will either circle back as a budget office or we will track down the appropriate person to get back to you in short order.
Thank you, Director Profit, and I would like to extend a welcome to your new position. Glad to have you here. And actually, yes, I was consulting with Senator Billinger, and actually both the Appropriations and Ways and Means will have JG and probably yourself coming to the respective committees to go through the details again in regards to the revenues and also the governor's budget. Again, I would ask all members while we're asking questions to make sure that your microphones are muted unless you are asking the question specifically. So a few questions I have. First, I'll try to go in the order that you had in your presentation, Director Profit. And the first is, we're not making the PMIB loan, the final payment, in fiscal year 2021. And we're basically, even though we're not taking a loan out, we are extending the current loan to 2023 and then basically refinancing that over 10 years. Is that correct?
Correct, sir.
And as you mentioned in your comments that depending on what the economic status of the state of Kansas is, we may pay it off sooner than 10 years, but basically we're going to be refinancing that final payment for 10 years.
That's correct. Yes, we put that on a 10-year payback schedule.
And then in regards to the reamortization of the unfunded liability on CAPERS, having that for an extension of 25 years, what would be the total interest cost to the state and to the people of Kansas?
Yep. So if I may clarify, Mr. Chairman, it's an extension of 10 years to make it a total 5-year reamortization. So it's not extending 25, it's extending 10.
15.
I'm sorry?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. The total incremental interest between the current schedule and the proposed schedule is in the neighborhood of $4.6 billion. Now, it's important to note that it's current proposed. If the board is to choose to reamortize in a couple of years, that will also increase the interest cost there. So the apples to apples comparison would be like versus if the board were to amortize in 3 or 4 years, because that would be the incremental interest cost at that point. I have a firm number. I'm sure Alan Conroy could answer some of those questions, but right now it's a $4.6 billion cost over that 25 years.
In regards to the 10% across the board cut, do we know exactly what agencies may be receiving some additional money from the U.S. government in regards to the latest relief package that was passed in December and signed by the president?
We don't have the final. It came so late in the game, and it wasn't signed by the president until December 27th. It's a little bit different than what's happened in the past, where most of this is funding directly to a lot of these agencies. There are estimates out there on some sites. Not many of them have been finalized. Secretary Burns Wallace, with the Recovery Office, is tracking these very, very closely. I would recommend having a conversation with her to identify exactly what fund to what agency. But quite frankly, we're waiting on guidance from the feds on some of these accounts still.
And then in regards to the $1.3 million that was, and that was the amount that was cut in fiscal year 2021, correct, from EDIF?
Are you on Commerce, sir? Are you on Department of Commerce?
Yes, Department of Commerce.
Yes, the amount was restoring the entirety of the 10% EDI.
And that's just for the Department of Commerce, not for any other cuts that were made to EDIF?
I believe that to be true. Verify that and you know.
And my final question is, do we have a total amount for the deferred maintenance for our National Guard armories?
I do not have that number sitting, but I do have an email that I can get to you later today. If that's okay, and I'll send it to the entirety of the committees.
All right, that's fine. We'll go ahead and move on to other individuals who would like to ask you some questions. Senator Billinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Adam. Appreciate the presentation. A couple quick questions. I'm going to go back to CAPER. So that would change the unfunded liability up to $13.6 billion. Is that right?
I don't believe it changes the unfunded liability. What it does is extends the payment terms of it. So instead of adding to the balance that's owed, it sort of slows down the pace at which we're paying it back.
Okay, then you mentioned on the higher ed, on these backfills, are we using federal dollars? What are we using? Is there some federal CARES money that you're using for that, or is it one-time money?
Yeah, so everything that I spoke to on this protecting investments in higher ed was the SGF. So again, their starting point was to reduce their SGF budget. We were putting back into the SGF. Again, this does not account for the very recently passed with the package from the feds, and the Office of Recovery is going to be working through that and seeing what the impacts are.
We're having a hard time hearing you, and I apologize. That's why I'm asking some of these questions. And, you know, you mentioned on the marketplace facilitator, and I didn't catch that. You was breaking up. So that's a new sales tax?
It's an existing sales tax, but what we're doing right now, and I'm getting some feedback as well from 112, what it is going to do is right now, marketplace facilitators, for anybody who is out of state that sells a product to somebody in Kansas, but they don't have shop set up in Kansas, they have to collect, we don't have to collect the sales taxes from them. So by enacting this provision, it keeps the same sales tax on that product that's out there, but makes it against the physical products in a Kansas front store, and also folks that are selling in Kansas via marketplace facilitator.
Okay, and another question on the IT improvements. Are we using any CARES money for that? I know some states are. Is that part of the plan, or are we not using any of that for that? And why not?
So as it relates to the IT investments here, outside of what I discussed on the Department of Labor, where we're talking about $37.5 million over 2 years, that was largely federal and special revenue funds. The other dollar amounts that I quoted in there are state general funds or state funds of some sort. That's not to say we are not leveraging federal funds, but again, the Office of Recovery is tracking that sort of separate from what the governor's proposed budget is going to be. It's not to say we don't talk to each other, but they're the ones that would have all the details.
Okay, and then on the human services, where we're restoring some of these monies, does that include the pay raises that were line item vetoed for the IDD community?
It does not. It does not.
Okay, and then I guess the remodeling Representative Waymaster asked that one. Okay, and then last question on the prisons. I think some of this we had in the budget last year and it was cut, like at Winfield. Is that the same thing that we had proposed in last year's budget?
Yes, sir. It's going back. It's going back but it's also splitting across a couple of different fiscal years.
These were putting back in that were cut out of last year's budget, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Representative Wolfmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation and welcome, Director Profit. Happy to have you aboard. I have a couple quick questions. My first one's a clarification, though, on the PMIB money. So because that does not accrue any interest, whatever we would owe today would be the same amount that we would owe 3, 4, 5 years from now, correct?
That's correct. It is a 0% funding. So
Okay, thank you.
it does not increase the balance.
Got it. Okay, and then a question on page 16 about behavioral health. You have 2 million allocated for CMHCs for specialized services in nursing facilities for mental health. And this may be a question that you're not prepared to answer, and that's okay. Someone can get back with me. But I am not aware, which means probably nothing, that CMHCs do work in nursing facilities for mental health. Is this a new initiative or additional money? Do you happen to know?
If okay, I'd like to refer you to Secretary Howard. I think she'd be able to give a much deeper and broader answer than I'd be able to.
Is she on now, or you mean later on?
Not on. I was going to be later, but I'll make sure to connect with her today. We can answer.
Okay, we can follow up. And then my last question is, on page 17, your estimate for the number of people covered by Medicaid expansion went up to 165,000 Kansans. I think I understood, but I want to make sure I'm correct. That number went up because people who unfortunately lost their job due to the pandemic and now find themselves without health insurance because they've lost this job, many of these people would be newly eligible if they still are without employment and would be able to take advantage of this. Is that right? Is that what caused the increase?
That's correct. The increase there was largely just to account for, the increase in unemployment and likely the new level of members that would be eligible, hopefully for a short period of time as we get back on track and those unemployment rates continue to go down. Expansion is income-based, as you know, goes up to 138% of FPL. So reduction in a job reduces income, makes you eligible. It's just an estimate right now. Again, the agency is going to be working through that. And we'll stay tightly connected with them to make sure that we understand all of the ins and outs.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Williams.
Can you hear me?
Yes. We can hear you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I have a couple questions, if I may. One is to go back on the marketplace facilitator question. Adam, you stated that, well, actually in the document, it's 85 million for the marketplace plus the digital. And I kind of wanted you to go back over how you derive those numbers, considering the last budget, it was about half that amount. So it was about 22 million for marketplace and 25 million for digital. And also, if you could speak a little bit to, again, why that number was up, because revenue is already collecting a vast majority. Because for clarification, the way I understand it, marketplace facilitators would be those businesses that contract with sellers such as Etsy and eBay, and even in some cases, Amazon, not the entirety of what we all do online. So maybe just back up and explain how those numbers were doubled, and that will help us.
Sure. Thank you for the question and for the opportunity to clarify. The numbers that are presented this year are in coordination with the Department of Revenue. They would be the subject matter experts for all things tax and revenues coming into the state. As I understand it, they've gone back through and scrubbed their analysis. They're sort of analyzing, who may be participating and may not be participating. There is a rather large marketplace facilitator out there in the ecosystem that may not be participating right now. So adding that would be a large one. But I would say it's not an across the board collection as it stands today. So making this uniform and making sure it's in there is going to increase the revenues and again, make it more fair for local businesses. But Department of Revenue is really the one that they're the experts in that. So I'd be happy to sit down with you and with them and we can talk through all that together if that would be helpful for you.
It just seems a little bit high or maybe a lot high. And on the digital property, that would require legislation, correct?
Yes, and there will be bills as such.
And then my second question, if I may, Mr. Chairman, is a follow-up on your question. And it's about the governor's commitment to close up the Bank of KDOT and shift that to the Bank of Capers. And my question is, you mentioned that there's 4.6 billion of additional cost in interest for 25 years, but can you break that down just for the 10 years extension with the reamortization? And maybe you mentioned it and I didn't hear you when you responded to our chairman. Thank you.
I want to make sure I understand your question correctly. When you say break it down versus the cost of just a 10-year extension, can you expound on that a little bit, please?
Yes. So you said that it's $4.6 billion of interest, I believe, over the 25 years. Is that correct?
Correct.
And I wanted to go backwards. What would be the interest cost just for the last 10 years with the legacy that would be added on?
I can get to you rather quickly. I have a hard copy of what that is in front of me. I'd like to have it in the spreadsheet so I can just click and drag and see what the total is, but I can get that back to you very quickly. Somebody might even be able to help me while we're in the room here to pull that up. And that back.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if there's time later, I may ask another. Thank you.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask a question also on the digital property. Would that include things like Netflix?
I'm a little out of my element there. I believe it would. It is for property and streaming services.
Okay, and so the 86 million additional collected tax dollars, are we doing anything to offset that? Kansas is ranked almost dead last as far as our tax burden goes. And so we're going to add $86 million to the taxes. We had a bill a few years ago that had this in there, but it also offset it with other tax breaks. Like allowing them to deduct their mortgage and then foreign income taxing and things like that. Are we offsetting this additional tax burden at all, or are we going to put this on top of what everyone is already paying?
As I understand it, sir, this is a standalone policy.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I have one more question if I can.
That's fine.
All right. Under Medicaid expansion, I'm having difficulty with the numbers. The way I understand it is that we would pay 10% and the federal would pay 90%. But you said that we would pay 19 million and draw down 541 million. I just don't. I would think that we would have to pay 54 million. And that's only, by the way, on 6 months. So it would be 108 million for the year, right?
Your math and doubling that would be correct. Yes. Where this gets a little tricky is finance is not necessarily as simple as what you might find in other areas of the world. Yeah, there is a 90-10 match in the feds off the bat. There are also other offsets that come into play with that. The two largest will to mind, and again, I've been out of Medicaid for 7 months now, so I'm no longer an expert if I ever was. But the two larger offsets would be there's drug rebates that come in, so we do get rebates on a lot of the drug products that go out, and then also there is a health insurer provider fee assessed to each of the MCOs, by which they're paying back 5.77% of premiums to the state. Also been ferreted out in states like Ohio have published what their net cost to the state was, or their effective match rate is really what they call it. When you take the federal match rate and all the other offsets that come in, and they're down in the 3.1% range, at least as of about 12, 18 months ago.
Okay, I'd like to dig a little deeper on that when you come before the committee, because it's not kind of voodoo accounting to me. The second part of this is you're looking at 165,000 Kansans for $19 million. I get it's 6 months, but that's $115 for insurance for 6 months. And if you add the federal 10%, it will be roughly $2,000 a year for insurance. How do they do that?
This might be, if you're okay with it. If you're okay with it, I think it'd be better if we had some of the capitation rates and the schedules over 12 months. If you're going to invite me back to the appropriations, I can have time to confer with the current Medicaid director and that staff to make sure that I'm representing them and their calculations accurately. I'll be back in front of appropriations. I think that might be a good time if you're okay with that, sir.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my colleagues have asked many of the questions. Thank you, Mr. Prophet, for joining us and sharing the information. If I may, on the PMIB loans, I think the questions have been asked. As I try and follow the numbers, it might be helpful just to see it laid out at some point, what we currently are doing and what's being proposed. I think it was 3 years and then payments would be picked up for the next 7, if I heard it correctly, and I may have that wrong, but that would be helpful. So thank you, and thanks for the information and the questions on that. I agree with my previous 2 colleagues on the internet tax bills. Be helpful maybe to see what else is being taxed. The digital goods number seems to be quite a bit different than the previous one, but it could also just be my memory. The rates are pretty consistent, but it must just be to whom it applies, and how that has perhaps shifted in the last couple of years that we've been looking at it would be helpful to be able to rely upon the number. So, and then, please.
So I was saying, okay, we certainly do that.
So thank you. And then I appreciate the points on papers, because that gives me entirely too many things to start bothering people on. But I think the 4.5 billion is just the increased interest over the interest we are already expecting to pay by moving it for 10 more years. I think I know how that is being done, but just to be clear, do you know, I assume that's a level % of payroll reamortization and not a level dollar reamortization?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
And then you mentioned that the CAPERS board has talked about reamortization. Do you know which method they have been leaning towards in their reamortization? And did the actuary weigh in on any thoughts of what methods we might use?
I have not had that level of conversation with Conroy, but I'm quite certain he would have that information handy.
Okay, that would be a big difference between the impact of the reamortization would be the method that each one would recommend in terms of what those payments might be. You'd mentioned that it was I don't have the words right, but a fairly common practice when you're within 10 years of being 80% funded to reamortize. I'd be curious what states have followed that and what the outcome has been for them, if that's our model. It's not as consistent with what I'd heard, and not that I'd expect you to know that, but it'd be helpful to see how that has worked to consider whether to go that route.
We can certainly track that down for you, or do our best.
Thank you. You mentioned our biggest plus is that immediate stability of 158 million, which it absolutely would give us at the cost that then's mentioned. As we look to that, are there places where we can find money at a cost below 7.75%, in that is what each dollar in capers does cost us? There absolutely are times when we are troubled, and that's why the unfunded liability has that flexibility. But at 7.75, that's 12.25 million a year, just for the first year's piece that we're extending, and that's every year that we don't pay it. So did we look towards other things, and even the amount we would want in the ending balance versus having that, given that additional cost, which rivals some of the requests that we get just there?
Sure, I understand the question. I certainly appreciate that. It doesn't sound like I'm deflecting. I'm truly not. It's 8:30 for me on the job, as I mentioned, so I wasn't involved in very early discussions. But I know that, the governor has certainly looked at any and all available tools to make sure that we're stabilizing the budget and getting flexibility. You raise a good issue about the 7.75%. I would counter with, if there is, I'm not sure that there is one that gives us that budget flexibility over that course of 25 years, and also gives us the benefit of having a more manageable contribution rate, not only this year and into the future, which will allow us to maintain our commitment to making full and timely payments to the capers legacy unfunded. So I think the question has got to be twofold. You're on the right path with the 7.75%, but also the ability to make sure that we're not missing any payments, as we have done a couple of times recently, would have to be factored in as well, as you guys are discussing.
As I look to missing payments, as I impact the UAL, I think the biggest impact just has the most dollars in. So if I said I wanted to contribute 800 and I contributed 700, I might still be ahead to, if I wish to contribute 600 and actually contributed it. Am I off base on that line of thinking?
I'm not real sure, to be honest with you, Representative. I'd have to sit down and kind of talk through that with you and work through the calculations.
One more important issue, unless the chair needs to cut me off. The funded ratio you mentioned would continue to grow. I was wanting to figure out how that might be, knowing roughly where we are. To get a good handle on that, we might look at what the actual contribution to the state school group would be. I think if we take 150 million off of our actuarial payment currently, we're below our 626 million steady state amount, which is just the cost of interest and the cost of a year of service on the debt. And if we're under that one, then we're underwater trying to catch up, and that moves ahead of us. And if we're able to be above it, then we're able to be treading water or take it down. But that's kind of that level where we're treading water. And then we've got room above that to argue how quickly we would pay it off. But can you give us some information that shows how the funded ratio would grow, as well as even where we would be? In last year's plan, I think that we got back to today's liability. Again, this was last year's plan. In 2033. So the current liability that we had, we returned on a dollar basis. Granted, our funded ratio would be higher, but just the dollars we owed would be extended to 2033, and extended our time to get to 80% to 2036. And again, 80% is where we read it as the lights quit flashing, and you say we can withstand some rough weather should it come our way. But be curious if that funded ratio continues to grow, that would be helpful in figuring out exactly what contributes to that.
So I'll give you just a couple of really quick answers, if you don't mind. So the current actuarial liability, if you look at 2021 as proxy, it's 21.5 million. Then not until 2032 that we get back to the 21.2 million, still in the same neighborhood. So 21 to 22, so an 11-year delay on that. On the ratio, you mark that as the magical number, so to speak. The lights quit flashing, I think is what you said. Currently, we'll have there at 2026. Realization gets us there in 2034, which is about the same 8-year delay that was referenced last year.
Thank you.
And we can share this with you in software so you have it in front of you.
All right, thank you. Just to let everybody know, the House is in session starting at 11, but we are pro forma, so we'll go ahead. We do have a list of other individuals who want to ask questions, so we'll continue with the questions for Director Profit. The next representative I have is Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Adam, if I understand what you're telling us here is, so we're going to give employees give pay raises to employees across the state without restoring the IDD cut of 20+ million. Is that correct?
The state employee pay increase is 2.5% for this year. Yes, the IDD rates will maintain at the rates that they were in 20.
Okay, and then on the online sales tax, is there a threshold then for small businesses that will not be subjected to it?
Perfectly honest with you, ma'am, I will have to look at the details of the bill. I don't have that answer in front of me. It's a very good question. We can get back with you on that.
Okay, and then just two more, Mr. Chairman. One's a comment. I think it would be good for us, and Representative Tarwater kind of hit on this, is a worksheet to show us how you came up with your Medicaid expansion numbers. That's a comment, not requiring an answer. And then my other question is on the $2 million for the CMHC and the nursing facilities. That's not a federal match, is that correct? Because the Medicaid dollars can't be spent that direction? So that's all SGF.
That is correct. To the best of my knowledge, I will confer with Secretary Howard to make sure, but I believe that is correct, yes.
Okay, one of the things I guess I'd like you to look at as you visit on it is, I think that we can figure out how to come in with a Medicaid match if we are able to get the legislation passed that was recommended by the Mental Health Modernization Committee on the passage of CCBHCs. So I'd like to look into that a little bit further.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Chairman. One of the questions I have in my district especially, school enrollments are down, and as you probably know, that Kansas ranks either 5th or 6th for outward migration. Is there anything in this governor's bill or something would kind of try to grow Kansas and maybe give these people an incentive to stay here or move back here to grow this state?
So if it's okay with you, sir, I like to refer those questions to the governor's office and what her overall strategy might be outside of what we discussed today, and showing that we are fully committed to fully funding K-12 education to ensure that there is a strong education system here in Kansas, as well as higher ed to ensure that we can grow that base for future business leaders here in Kansas, and also the economic development that have been put in. Outside of that, I think it would be best to discuss with the governor's office or some of the other agencies. And I know that's kind of an on-answer, but we outlined some of the things that we're investing in to ensure that the future of Kansas, both education and the economy, is a strong one that people can be proud of being a Kansas.
Representative Corbett, did you have another question?
No, thank you.
Representative Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you, Director Profit, for joining us. I wanted to circle back on a couple of things that I think Representative Wolfmore and Representative Tarwater had touched on around the expansion numbers. This is, my 5th year in the legislature. Before this year, the projections on potential eligible Kansans hovered somewhere around the 130 to 150,000 range. I think you mentioned before, we would expect that 165,000 projection to possibly come down as the economic situation, post-COVID improves. Did I hear you right?
That was The hope, yes. Let me say it backwards. The increase from 150, which has been the number the last couple of years, to 165 is a hedge against enrollment given the current state of employment in the economy.
So as far as that goes for dollars coming into our state, in essence, at a time when we have frankly more folks in need of medical coverage and more need for dollars coming into the state of Kansas, as things are kind of at their worst in that, we would, for pennies on the dollar, be bringing in millions and millions of extra dollars into the state of Kansas. And as the economic situation improves and therefore incomes rise, that number would sort of phase out as we enter into better economic times in Kansas. Am I understanding the mechanics of that right?
Certainly, the higher enrollment, since in Kansas it's on a per capita basis, the dollar figure goes up, but there is a corresponding expense, which would be a revenue to the hospitals, the doctors, the CMHCs, and others. So yeah, there could be an increased level while enrollment is up that would return to a normal level. I know a lot of folks talk about this as an economic development tool, and certainly there are economic benefits, but really it's about protecting the healthcare needs of these vulnerable Kansans.
Great, I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to come back to K-12 briefly and kind of compare it. We saw that in the budget that there's a reduction of about $43 million to the juvenile evidence-based program that impacts many of our kids that are in our public school system. And as I look at, you can't tell from reading this chart, it says that we prior year difference in unweighted enrollment 650. But there's some reasons that that's stayed or projected at that. It's actually over 17,000 students that we've lost this last year or this current year. But going back to how we've reduced for the juvenile evidence-based budget, can you kind of back us up to 2019, fiscal year 2019? How much more have we added to the K-12 education budget in state general fund?
Yep. I could that I only have in front of me, unfortunately, the fiscal 20 through fiscal 22. So the growth in state foundation aid from 20 to 22 is about $200 million, if you will. I believe I've seen a number of upwards of $300 million for K-12. If I can circle back to the evidence-based program fund that you were talking about, you're correct. There was an allotment to the tune of $42.2 million from that fund. There is a continual appropriation in that of $14.3 million. What we've seen in that fund, and I'll do the numbers off the chart, the ending balance in this fund going from fiscal 17 through fiscal 20 was $8.9 million. And then $17.2 million, and then $30 million, and $42 million. Expenditures that has either actualized or been planned for, it has actualized is $9.6 million. So even by reducing that fund by $42 million, with the appropriation of $14.3 million, that more than covers the highest level of expenditures that have come out of that fund. So it's still protecting the fund and the expenditures they've seen.
Okay, and I know we're going to get deeper into that, and there's some discussion and debate on how that program should actually be managed. I just wanted to make the point that in K-12, we've added about $900 million since fiscal year 2019, and we'll add another $200 million in another year. And some of our programs for our most at-risk kids have been hit. And so I thank you for the opportunity to share that.
I'm not showing anybody else that is wishing to ask any further questions.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Ballard?
Thank you. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get in, so I've been listening by phone. I just want a clarification. Were there additional funding added for mental health, especially after this summer we had the task force on the modernization of mental health What was the funding for CMHCs?
I don't have just a specific CMHC number in front of me, but yes, there were several enhancements across the newly formed Department of Human Services. $2 million for CMHC specialized services at the NFMHs, $5 million for the statewide mobile response and stabilization, $3 million for family crisis response and support, a host of other things, and the normal, if you will, day-to-day stuff that KDADS, as it currently is, already commits to.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just hadn't heard that. Thank you.
No problem. Is there anybody else that wishes to ask any questions for Director Profit? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Obviously, as I mentioned before, we will be having Director Profit coming before both the Appropriations and the Ways and Means. This will give you some additional time to look through the documents that has been supplied by the Office of Budget. And at that time, then we can have more questions for Director Profit. But Director, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and going through the details of the governor's budget. With that, members, I want to say thank you for being patient with some of the technical difficulties that we had. I don't know exactly what happened, why we went offline there for a little bit, but obviously this is going to be the new format that we move forward in our committee rooms. And I'd like to thank everybody who's listening for, bracing with us and going through this in a different format that we have entered in the legislative session of 2021. So with that, members, we are adjourned.